Hello, welcome to this edition of IMO Bastani with me, Aaron Bastani, at Aaron Bastani on Twitter. You can talk about, discuss, say what you like about this content under the hashtag IMO Bastani. Thanks for watching. So Sunday saw the referendum in Greece on the latest bailout deal between Greece and its creditors, the European Central Bank, the IMF and the European Union. The vote was an overwhelming no, OXI. It was a landslide in the end, 61%, almost 2-1 against the terms of that deal, against more broadly the continuation of what's viewed by many Greeks as economic orthodoxy, which is leading to social and political catastrophe, an orthodoxy which has led to 25% unemployment, a quarter reduction in average wages, economic contraction of the country by between a quarter and a third. Politically, it was also a decisive moment because clearly now anti-austerity forces in Greece go beyond just the radical left, beyond those who voted for Syriza in January's elections. In those elections, Syriza got just over a third of the popular vote. That was insufficient for them to form a majority government. They had to go into coalition with the right-wing ANL. OXI on Sunday, on the other hand, got 61%. So it's clear that the anti-austerity movement in Greece, far from being isolated elements of the radical left or radical right, is now inarguably the dominant voice in Greek politics. While many Greeks and their allies across the continent are understandably elated, they're ecstatic right now, the big picture hasn't really changed very much. For about 10 days before the referendum, the ECB was effectively trying to crash Greek banks. That hasn't changed. I'm speaking on the Tuesday. The ECB has not changed tack, and Greek banks only really have enough liquidity, we're told, for the next 2-3 days. Brussels and Berlin have made it very clear over the last 3 to 4 years that they don't care so much about what the average Greek or Italian or Spaniard or Portuguese citizen has to say about the predicaments of their respective nations. What the vote on Sunday has changed, however, is that the option taken by Brussels and Berlin in 2011 and 2012, when the crisis really was hitting a breaking point in both Italy and Greece, was that interim administrations can no longer be parachuted in. If you remember, in 2011, Mario Monti became a kind of interim emergency government. He led an emergency government in Italy. Similar thing happened with Lucas Papademos in Greece. Ideally, the Troika would have liked to have seen a repeat of that. They would have liked to have crashed Syriza, completely disabuse them of any legitimacy or credibility, and impose another kind of interim technocratic government to agree to the deal that was on the table. That's not happened, and with the level of consensus behind OXI and the popular support now behind Syriza and anti-austerity more generally, it's pretty fair to say that what happened with Papademos in 2011 won't be repeated in Greece anytime soon. In spite of that, in spite of the fact that the European institutions remain as stubborn, as obstinate as ever, despite the fact that I think Grexit is almost inevitable, despite that, Sunday was significant for a number of reasons. It was significant because if you look at the forces arranged against OXI, which, like I say, won by a vote of 2-1, it overwhelmingly, an overwhelming victory. If you look at the forces arranged against it, what were they? They were every single private newspaper and TV channel in the country. It was big business. It was the two large parties of Greek democracy, PASOK, read Labour in Britain, and New Democracy, the Conservatives. It was all the major European institutions, the ECB, like I said, trying to crash Greek banks, create panic and ensure the right outcome. It was Martin Schulz, a socialist from the European Parliament, appearing on Greek television whilst Greek politicians were disbarred from doing so. Despite all of that, despite the money, the influence and the credible institutions, yes, performed poorly. Why did it perform poorly? Because it didn't appeal to popular anger. Probably the first time since the crisis began, popular anger and a disgust with the existing state of things was good enough to pull off the impossible. A lot of people, including myself, thought OXI would win, but nowhere near this margin. That they did shows that the anti-austerity movement in Greece, and arguably in Europe more broadly, is far stronger and potentially far more popular than many have considered until now. While Greece looks almost unique in the European landscape in terms of its economic performance, and it is indisputably the worst performing economy in both the Eurozone and the EU more generally, it shares a number of features with countries not just in Europe South, but right across the continent. Immediately, of course, you only need to look at other periphery economies like Spain, Italy and Portugal, and they, of course, are enduring very similar economic data regarding unemployment, regarding low or no growth, regarding wages, regarding what could broadly be described as, economic inertia. More importantly than that, though, I think Sunday's OXI and the fact that it came in the face of a campaign led by the two historic parties of Greek democracy since 1974 tells you a broader story about where the European Union and its democracies are at. If you look at the UMP and the Parti Socialiste in France, both are effectively parties of austerity. You look at Labour and the Conservatives in Britain, both are effectively parties of austerity. That's a similar tale right across the continent, and Syriza, along with those political projects in Spain, which won so outstandingly in cities right across Spain in May this year, are puncturing the myth that there's no alternative and showing that politics and political actors can emerge, which is saying dramatically different things to the political institutions so many of us have grown up alongside. It might sound kind of outlandish to hear, but it increasingly feels like 2015 is the year that neoliberalism in Europe began to die. Now, if that sounds exaggerated, hear me out. Already this year, in January, we've had Syriza form a government in Greece. Like I said, in May, in 4 of the 5 largest cities in Spain, radical democratic movements won effectively mayors and councils. Now we've had a referendum organised with only, I think, a week or 10 days notice, give an overwhelming no to austerity, to the institutions of the EU, and to a political consensus which had until very recently been internalised by the entire Greek political establishment. That tells you quite simply that populism is back, and that more than that, it can win. But when you look at, like I say, those forces arranged against OXI, arranged against Syriza, anti-austerity forces in Greece, it's really impressive to think that anger went as far as it did. What does this mean for Britain? I can already hear you say, Aaron, look, Greece is really different to Britain. It's suffering really different, unique problems compared to the United Kingdom. Same for Italy, same for Spain, same for Portugal. These guys are all in the Eurozone. They couldn't have devalued their currencies after 2008 like Britain did. They didn't have that option, thereby they didn't have the ability to kickstart exports, growth, jobs through export orientation like Britain did by devaluing the currency and making their exports more competitive on the global market. They didn't have that option. If they did, the crisis would never have been so bad, and of course Grexit would mean, if Grexit were to happen, which I think, like I say, is inevitable, that Greece would be able to leave the euro, devalue, and probably kickstart exports, jobs and growth. That would almost, again, be indisputable. The same would be true for Italy if they readopted the lira, or Spain with the peseta. I think there are actually real economic similarities and parallels to be drawn between both Britain and those economies in the Eurozone. But more important than that, I think that they suffer from very, very similar political problems, which is a sense that the institutions we've all inherited from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s haven't really offered a compelling narrative of where we go next after the crisis, or a vision of the future. That holds true for the Parti Socialiste in France, Labour in Britain, the Tories, the UMP, the PSOE in Spain, PASOK or New Democracy in Greece. I think all of these parties increasingly look like they're worn out, that they're on the way out, and that new insurgents, newcomers, if they're ready and up for it, could potentially form governments in countries beyond simply just Greece. Until now, those energies in Britain have been isolated to, of course, the rise of the SNP in Scotland, 56 of 59 seats north of the border after May's general election, and to a lesser extent UKIP and the Greens, although the breakthrough they made in May really can't be understated. UKIP 3.7 million votes, the Greens 1 million votes. I think with the return of populism, like I say, to Europe in a way that's really unseen since the Second World War, it's fair to say those events will only intensify, that UKIP will probably do pretty well in the forthcoming years, likewise the Greens, probably likewise other independents and new organisations, and organisations beyond the big 2.5. By that I mean Labour, the Tories and the Lib Dems. The bellwether moment for that will be Britain's referendum on European Union membership. And this could present an outstanding opportunity for UKIP, even if they lose. In fact, I think the best outcome for UKIP would be to lose, but maybe marginally, right? You can imagine a 55-45 split, and Nigel Farage can tell his people, look, we were up against the BBC, the CBI, all the major parties, big business, and we still got almost half the country, which would be actually pretty accurate. accurate. If on the back of that you then have European elections the following year and a general election 2-3 years after that, UKIP could make big inroads, and they would be looking at more than 1 or 2 MPs. But equally, they may dissolve this time next week. That's the thing with radical politics. You never know. That could have happened to Syriza in 2012, but look where we are. They took 35% plus of the vote in January, and they've just landed a punch on the nose of the biggest institutions in Europe. That means for those of us on the left, those of us who are passionate about social justice, those who are passionate about a better economy, a better way of doing politics, that we've got 2 options. Either we have to leave this thing, we have to leave the European Union, we have to begin to construct new internationalist institutions, organisations, ways of doing things beyond those we presently have. That's one option. Or we say, look, Europe, the European Union, as it is, the status quo is indefensible, and if we stay in this thing, it's only so we can radically transform it in partnership with other countries, which would have to include Greece. For what it's worth, I think that Greece won't even be in the Eurozone by the time this vote happens. And the way they're being treated by Northern Europe, by Brussels and Berlin, I think it's almost certain actually that Britons will vote to leave. A lot of the people that are watching this probably won't like that. They might not even agree. But I think over the next 18 months we're going to see the worst of the worst when it comes to the EU. So what do you think? You know what I think? Why don't you put those thoughts in the comments on YouTube and on Facebook, or on the hashtag IMO Bastani. You can always tweet at me, at Aaron Bastani, and we could perhaps have a discussion on the merits of staying in or leaving the European Union. That's all for this week. It was another IMO al fresco. It's a bit chillier today. It didn't rain, fortunately. Hopefully it'll be very sunny, nice and shiny next time I speak to you.